Hello all, the following video is for the purposes of revision, with the aim of presenting a brief recap of the poem, some analysis, some of the questions raised by the poem, and potential links with other poems in the anthology. As always, nothing in this video will be more important than your own reflections on the poem. So the recap. In this 7-stanza poem with a consistent AA-BB rhyming pattern, the poet, now a grown man, looks back on his childhood and wonders why the horses on his farm used to inspire feelings of awe and fear in him as a boy, when now those horses seem so ordinary. As he begins to recall the effect the horses had on him, images of magic, fire, elemental power, industry, and an almost godlike presence begin to crowd his mind. In the final stanza, the man returns to his adult life and laments the fact that neither the horses nor the landscape can any more exert the once tremendous power they had over his imagination. The magic power of his young imagination is gone forever. Analysis. The title, Horses, so simple and seemingly mundane, sets the tone for the opening lines, which begin with the simple observation of some farm horses. The adjectives used to describe them, lumbering and steady, portray an ordinary, consistent, frankly uninteresting presence, which leads to the question that begins in the following line. In that second line, the first use of caesura with the hyphen, followed by 2 commas, slow down the rhythm of the poetry, as the poet's tone moves towards reflection. Caesura roughly translates as to cut off in Latin, and here the poet's initially relaxed observation of the horses is cut off, as his memory and imagination begin to shift towards his past, when the horses seemed terrible, so wild and strange. Now the language points to something of mysterious power. The simile in like magic power on the stony grange sees the poet's imagination beginning to recall the impact of the horses, as his mind moves from the ordinary present to the extraordinary past. The magic power belonged to the horses, but perhaps also to the young poet's imagination. In the second stanza, the poet refers explicitly to the childish hour when his perception of the horses and perhaps life was so dramatically different. The use of the word hour points to the brevity of youth, and this is the first hint of the poet not only reflecting upon, but also lamenting the loss of his youth. Here we have also the first mention of the fear the horses inspired in the young boy, as well as the first references to the Industrial Revolution. The blackening rain portrays the pollution coming from the factories, while also lending an apocalyptic feel to the scene. Indeed, apocalyptic is a word and an atmosphere that will continue to haunt the poem. With the next simile, their hooves like pistons in an ancient mill. The horses' movements are likened to something mechanical as they work the land, just as pistons work in factories. But the word ancient also hints at something timeless. Then we come across that word seem, recalling seemed in the first stanza, as though even in his increasingly ambitious and poetic attempts to describe the horses, he cannot quite define them. They retain that mysterious magic power, which escapes easy, rational definition. He cannot say what they are, but only what they seem to be. With the third stanza, the images continue to vary. Their conquering hooves, which trod the stubble down, offers a warlike vision of the horses, and here there is perhaps a subtle reference to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse from the book of Revelation, which adds to that fearful, apocalyptic, end-of-the-world atmosphere mentioned earlier. And then come the first explicitly religious references. The word ritual may refer to the regular and crucial ploughing of the fields, but it is also a word charged with spiritual connotations of worship. Their great hulks emphasize the physical size and strength of the horses, but describing them as seraphims of gold adds a metaphysical element. A seraph is a kind of celestial or heavenly being, and the literal translation of the word seraph is burning ones. So here enters the image of fire, something we will discuss more later. The gold offers a vision of majesty and splendour, and at this point in the poem, the horses seem to oscillate between their powerful physical presence in the moment and the timeless metaphysical quality that they seem to embody, as though they were creatures both of our world and another. Described as mute, ecstatic monsters on the mould, the horses continue to take on an unnatural, otherworldly aspect, incorporating both the beautiful and the monstrous, much like the snake in Judith Wright's The Hunting Snake. The fourth stanza sees the poet exclaim, "And oh, the rapture," as his memory and imagination really begin to fire. Rapture suggests an encounter with a divine power, as though his youthful perception of the horses somehow offered a kind of spiritually transcendent experience. And from that suggestion of spiritual elevation follows one of the most obviously poetic lines of the poem so far. They marched broad-breasted to the sinking sun. With its use of alliteration, rolling vowel sounds, and sibilants providing a form of aesthetic beauty to mirror the glory of the horses and the grandeur of the sinking sun. The word marched perhaps alludes to the warlike image used earlier with their conquering hooves, but along with broad-breasted, also portrays a sense of power and pride. The use of alliteration continues throughout the stanza, and now they are creatures of light, with the furrows they leave like struggling snakes, as though even the land takes on an imaginative life in their presence. Creatures of beauty, light, pride, and glory, these are horses to be admired and even honoured. Yet the next stanza begins with a definitive but, and the horses become something different again, continuing to escape singular rational definition, as again we see that word seemed. With their gigantic size, they again appear almost monstrous, and then we hear of their mysterious fire and smouldering bodies. For the second and third time in the poem, the horses are associated with fire, that entrancing but dangerous and ungovernable force. The same description might be applied to the imagination, and at this point we might justifiably ask, does that mysterious fire truly come from the horses or from the imagination of the child? From here, the diverse and ambiguous images continue, with the simile, their eyes as brilliant and as wide as night. The horses move from fire towards something as magnificent, huge, and dark as night itself. With the phrase, as wide as night, the horses are seen as an enormous but obscure force. But in the next line, they are depicted as cruel and destructive, bringing to mind the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse mentioned earlier, whose arrival signals the end of our world. For me, this stanza is the imaginative climax of the poem, and here, for the first and only time, the rhyme scheme falters, with the half-rhyme wind blind. the sounds do not quite match, and it's as if the wild rage and apocalyptic force of the horses is now beginning to break even the chains of poetic form. And then, just as these forces begin to seize the poet's imagination, they suddenly fade. The repetition and exclamation in those words, "It fades, it fades," lend a pathos to the poet's desperation to maintain that glorious, frightful, rapturous vision of the horses. The poem started with gentle amusement at how these simple, ordinary animals could once have had such power over him. But by the end, there is no amusement, only the sad realization that he has lost something that he can never get back. The childish hour is gone, and with it the fear and wonder that used to fire his imagination. He is pining for the world as he used to see it, and that word crystalline encapsulates the value, purity, and beauty of the child's imagination. In a way, the poet himself has become just as lumbering and steady as the horses he describes in the first stanza. Those bright and fearful presences are gone, and absence remains. And so a poem that begun with casual recollection of the past now ends with painful recognition in the present. Some questions to consider. It's called Horses, and the vast majority of the poem is spent talking about horses. But is it really about the horses themselves, or about the nature of the imagination, and the difference between the perception of an adult and the child? The poet, through observing the horses and his own reactions to them, ultimately learns something about himself. So, can observation and interaction with nature be a means towards greater self-understanding? What happens to the mind and imagination as we grow up? How and why does it happen? Does this poem offer an accurate vision of the difference between the imagination of youth and age? And finally, what effect might the impact of the Industrial Revolution have had on the boy? To finish then, a brief look at some links to other poems in the anthology. With its close observation of the horses, the poem can obviously be compared with The Hunting Snake, The Cockroach, and Pike. In all three poems, this close observation leads to questions about mankind, as well as the animals. Is what we see in the animals a reflection of what we see in ourselves? We can also look at the city planners and the planners, both of which criticize the excessive commitment to order and rationality found in cities. Edwin Muir's poem deals with irrational visions and forces, seemingly celebrating their presence in the imagination. A presence which cities, according to Atwood and Cheng, supposedly repress. When we consider the relationship between our identity and time, we might also look at Summer Farm. Does our identity change through time, or is our identity something that remains fixed and unchangeable, seeming to exist outside of time? That's all for now. If you have found the video useful, then please do subscribe for more poetry revision with Mr Brooker.